Thank you for joining me. I'm John Razimus, and in this episode of Hoax Hunter, we will be discussing Bob Lazar. This is part 1 of the Bob Lazar special. Did Bob Lazar work at Area 51? He claims he worked 15 miles south of Area 51, south of Groom Lake, about 15 miles, near Papoose Lake, at a super-secret facility, disguised to not be visible via satellite imagery, with the hangar doors having a sand-like texture perfectly blending in with the mountain. I've always been a fan of Bob Lazar's storytelling and his story. It's very interesting. I've listened to every single interview between Bob Lazar and Art Bell. Specifically, Bob Lazar was on the Coast to Coast AM radio show on 7 different appearances, starting December 12th, 1992, and ending in 2014. But Bob has done a plethora of TV interviews, from the Sci-Fi Channel, the History Channel, news specials, many interviews. I'm going to catalog in the future every single interview Bob Lazar has ever done, because the claim is that he barely and rarely does interviews. From what I've seen, this is not the case. He does interviews all the time, as long as the person asking for the interview has a high enough of a profile. Bob will usually say yes. George Knapp broke the Bob Lazar story in 1989 when he filmed Bob Lazar with a shadow face, and Bob claimed his name was Dennis. Bob claims that was an inside joke because his supervisor at S4, supposedly, his name was Dennis. This video is not going to be just debunking Bob Lazar. That's not my intention. This video isn't going to be proving the Bob Lazar story is not true. That's not my intention. My intention is to find the truth and seek the truth. I'm going to be looking at Bob's story from a scientific perspective. I'm going to be looking at Bob's story from perhaps a psychological perspective. I'll be looking at Bob's story from many different angles, including showing that was he telling the truth. I will show as much evidence that he was telling the truth as I can. Bob Lazar claims he was given the security clearance known as Majestic 12, clearing him to know about this extraterrestrial technology. He claims he was briefed on gray aliens that supposedly visited Earth. These extraterrestrials were purportedly from Zeta Reticuli. Did Bob Lazar see extraterrestrials with his own 2 eyes? These days, he usually plays it down, doesn't want to talk about it. But back in the day, he did confirm he did see an alien. And there's more to that story. I will talk about the aliens later in this video. Bob's story is more complex than is it true or is it false. It's more complex than that. I personally believe it's somewhere in between. But that in between, there are countless possibilities. Bob Lazar said, if we made all this stuff up, what was our motive? Why? Why did we make it up? If you think somehow we came up with this thing, then you gotta tell me why we did it. Proving someone hoaxed is not that difficult, but proving the motive behind why they hoaxed is a lot more difficult. I will take Bob up on that challenge, and I will explore, based on the evidence, Occam's razor and science, and Bob's history on what his possible motive could have been. It's extremely hot in the desert here near Area 51. I need to hydrate. I need my electrolytes. So if you're planning on storming Area 51, don't forget to bring electrolytes and drink them regularly. You don't want to be dehydrated. I'm drinking out of my lucky Area 51 mug here. This mug has a copyright 1995. And there's a reason for that. When Bob Lazar came forward in 1989, by 90, 91, 92, 95 was the height of Area 51, UFOs, aliens, flying saucers in pop culture of the 90s, and it all spawned with Bob Lazar. Similarly, history repeats itself. Bob Lazar was on the most popular podcast in the world, and a resurgence of interest in Area 51 to the point where over 1 million people said they want to go and storm Area 51. The Air Force has officially responded to the Storm Area 51 meme. Speaking with the Washington Post, Air Force spokeswoman Laura McAndrews said officials were aware of the event. She did issue the following warning. Area 51 is an open training range for the U.S. Air Force, and we would discourage anyone from trying to come into the area where we train American armed forces. The U.S. Air Force always stands ready to protect America and its assets. The Air Force is currently being trained on how to respond to this event. More surprisingly than the Air Force responding to Storm Area 51, Bob Lazar officially has responded, probably realizing and being told by various people that his appearance on the Joe Rogan podcast talking about a secret extraterrestrial program 15 miles south of Area 51 might have spawned this new meme. The following is Bob Lazar's response on Instagram. I have to comment on this Storm Area 51 thing. I do understand it was started as a joke by someone, but there are a number of people who are actually planning on showing up. This is a misguided idea. Area 51 is a classified research base. There are no aliens or alien technology located there. The only place there was ever any alien technology was at Site S4, south of Area 51 proper. That was 30 years ago. S4 may have moved decades ago, or it's possible it's no longer being used for the project. I do not support this movement. The last time someone tried to get into Area 51, he was shot. This is not the way to go about trying to get more information. What is good in the interest of the subject, the science and technology. This is what would immediately change the world we live in. So I thought that was a very interesting response by Bob Lazar. So Bob Lazar has had a huge impact on pop culture. There is no denying that whatsoever. I don't use a script in my videos, but I make notes. And this note has possible motives why Bob Lazar would have told his story. Clearly, telling the truth and exactly what he said happened for his own safety is one motive. But there are many more. There are countless motives. But I have written down what I believe to be the most likely motives. And telling the truth is on this list. Possible motive, in no particular order, is fame, recognition, legendary status in the UFO community. This could be a motive. He's legendary status in the UFO community. And if he doesn't recognize that, then he hasn't Googled himself. He's most definitely a legend in the UFO communities. That's a possible motive. Was Bob a disinformation agent, paid by the government to sell a story to the American people, to the world, that there are flying saucers in government hands that would scare enemies of the United States? They have anti-gravity? They have flying saucers? What the heck? That could potentially psychologically mess with our enemies. And using flying saucers as a psychological disinformation scheme is something the military has considered and thought about. Here is a memo talking about that very such subject. Using flying saucers for psychological purposes against our enemies. This document backs up that this is a possibility. MK Ultra, programmed, brainwashed, mind-controlled, hypnotized, tricked, drugged. This is a possible motive. Now, for those who say, yeah, right, he wasn't brainwashed, he wasn't mind-controlled, he wasn't hypnotized or drugged. If you listen to every interview from Bob Lazar, you will hear he does admit he was drugged. He does admit mind manipulation techniques were used. John Lear, one of Bob's good friends, says that they were surprised that these techniques didn't work on Bob. Take that with a grain of salt, but John Lear tends to repeat, word for word, things that Bob Lazar has told him in confidence. Did Bob Lazar see aliens? Depending on when you ask him, he will have a different answer.
Did you get to see any aliens at all?
No.
Obviously, these days he downplays it to an extreme degree, to the point where it wasn't even mentioned once on the Joe Rogan podcast. With Art Bell, he would usually lean in the direction of it being a doll. Bob Lazar drew this drawing of a photograph he claims he saw during a briefing when he was shown the extraterrestrial background information, just a few pages. According to the document he read, these beings are from Zeta Reticuli. Bob said he read it, but he couldn't confirm it. But according to John Lear, you're going to hear an amazing story. Bob Lazar, while reading one of these briefings, was sitting across from an actual extraterrestrial. According to John Lear, Bob Lazar was in the presence of these Zeta Reticulan gray aliens at least 3 times. Perhaps they wiped his memory of these incidents, which is why he has a hard time believing them or repeating them these days. But back in 1989, he was more open to having witnessed extraterrestrials firsthand. This is John Lear's retelling of the story, and the quote from Bob Lazar during that telling of that story is this: "You will never know what it's like to see your first alien." Bob described what it was like to be drugged at the base, and the description matches the movie Get Out being hypnotized so much that an MK Ultra mind control experiment could have actually taken place with Bob Lazar.
He said, "John, you will never know what it's like to see your first alien." I said, "You saw one? You saw one?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "It couldn't have been a doll. It couldn't have been..." No, it was one. And, these days you ask him that question, he says, "Well, I don't know. Could have been a doll. They were doing all these weird stuff."
Oh, yeah.
But that night, that's exactly what he said.
Okay.
And I said, "How did it happen?" He says, "Well, I was walking down the corridor." He said, "I got a guard on each side." And he said, "I walked by this door, and there's like a 12-inch window pane, and it has wires through it. And I looked through it, and there's two guys in lab coats facing me, and an alien standing up talking to them." Now, the original is blue, and I'm sure it's here somewhere, but this is the original drawing he made me, drawn by Bob Lazar, December 1988, January 1988, disc hangers at S4. Position of gray in relation to two scientists in lab coats, size, orientation, and construction of window through which he saw scientists and the gray. So he was scribbling all over. This is the test site, and whereas 4 was, this was the length of the hangars, 360 feet, and each bay was 40 feet long. This was how the saucers sat in the hangar. And this drawing right here is the two, and this is what Bob drew. These are the two lab technicians, and that's the little alien facing the other way. And he drew the door, and he drew that wire going through the window. He said he looked through that and saw those guys right there.
That's great. Did they ever have any exposure, like communication with them?
Yeah, 3 times, at least 3 times.
Really? Incredible.
So anyway, the 3 times that he saw the alien was the first time was when they gave him the pine-smelling fluid. And what they did, it's really interesting, when Bob came in here the very first day, and he said, "I saw a disc." I said, and he used to wear a ring, and I forget which finger it was on. I said, "Okay, now listen to me, Bob. They're going to give you some drugs and to make you forget what you're doing. So what I want you to do is, when they take you in to give you the drugs, I want you to take your ring off subtly and put it on your other hand. You won't remember, but when you come up to see me, I'll see it, and you'll know you already take the drugs." He said, "They already did that today." I said, "They did?" And he said, and he described this elaborate drug test of, how they took a needle and they put a rectangle on his, scratched a rectangle on his arm, and then made lines like this and lines like that, and then they take stuff and they put into each little square like that. And then they took him into a room, and he said the room was just like a regular doctor's office, and there was a couch, and he laid on the couch, and he said there was a screen and blocking something, and he said he knew the gray was behind it. Then there was a military guy with an M16, and a doctor and a nurse, and they had him drink the pine-smelling fluid, and he drank the cup, and immediately he felt, dizzy. And he said he described exactly what he felt like. He said he felt like he was in a well that was 100 feet deep, that his arms were 100 feet long, and he was just holding on to the sides of the well, just barely with his fingertips. That's what he felt like. Huh. He said then they started to read the clearance with which he was, or the briefing of the clearance with he was being given. So they'd say, they'd read a sentence, and say, "And I understand that, I am being briefed," and at the end, the soldier would take the M16 and poke it into his stomach like that. And he said it really hurt. And each different phase of the clearance, the soldier would take the M16 and poke it into his solar plexus. So, and so in the tapes that Lane Keck did, when we were trying to get the information out, they told him a lot of really interesting stuff. And when we would get to, well, what's going to happen in the future, he'd say, I'm not supposed to talk about that. And then Lane would try to work around it with some subtlety, and Bob would grab it, says, no, I can't, it hurts.
Oh, no.
And
Wow.
so that was the...
So like a programming thing.
Right. The 3 times, the once was when the pine-smelling fluid, and the once was seeing him in the room, and then once when George Knapp hired Tavernetti to come up and do the lie detector test. George rented a room at Caesar's Palace, and Bob and Gene Huff got there early, and they knew the room, and so they pulled the door open, and Gene pulled the door open, Bob looked inside, and he turned white and nearly fainted, and he walked over and he sat down in a chair, and Gene says, what in the heck is the matter with you? And Bob said, I just had a flashback. He said, I remember talking with the Gray. And what had happened is when they opened the door, the way that Tavernetti had said set up there, it wasn't very much light. It was one single table with a chair on one side and a chair on the other side and some equipment there. It triggered this reaction of Bob when he was reading the briefings and the Gray was across from him. And it was such an overwhelming experience of when you first, are in the presence of a Gray, when, you're used to asking a question and then having somebody respond, but when you're talking to an alien, they pick it up from your mind and they're answering before you can get out of your mouth, and it gets confusing. And it was just an overwhelming experience. So that was the other time that Bob had the...
A huge piece of evidence that Bob was mind-controlled or hypnotized or brainwashed or MK Ultra'd is the last 2 times he was flown into Area 51. Instead of having a memory of driving to S4, working there and driving back and flying back from Area 51 to Las Vegas, he said the last 2 occasions he worked, he had a memory of flying to Area 51 and flying back, and nothing in between. His memory was totally gone. He has 0 memory of what happened in between the flying back. That is a huge piece of evidence that perhaps Bob was brainwashed, or that he was like Men in Black. They flashed his memory and they erased it. Does such technology exist? I wouldn't put it past the military. I think such technologies are being developed and being experimented with. MK Ultra was a legitimate project in the past, which did involve mind manipulation. Concerning the secret base Bob Lazar claimed to have worked at, S4. Looking for confirmation of S4 on a map is going to be very difficult, but you can find it. S4 is an old aeronautical designation for roughly the area where Bob said the secret base was located. S4 likely stands for South 4, or it can also be known as Site 4. Just because the general location around Papoose Lake is called S4 from an aeronautical perspective, it doesn't mean there's a secret base there called S4. I've looked for many years, since the 90s, satellite imagery trying to find the existence of S4, and I've been unsuccessful. If they did disguise it perfectly to be hidden from satellite imagery, they have succeeded. Supposedly there's a parking lot at Area 52 designated Site 4, but that's not the S4 we're looking for. Those attempting to travel to Groom Lake or to Papoose Lake, these areas are secure. It is not recommended you get anywhere near these locations, and let me give you a really good reason why. The radiation bombing in the areas alone have caused the sand to be radioactive. Do not get close to that sand because it has been tested for many years as a bombing range for nuclear weapons. And the last man to walk across Papoose Lake, he is no longer with us because of the radiation. That's how severe it is. So stay away. But here's the story of the last person to walk across Papoose Lake. His name is Jerry Freeman. From an article in 1998 by Ken McCall of the Las Vegas Sun entitled Forbidden Journey, you can find Jerry Freeman's journey through Papoose Lake. On day 5, Sunday morning, April 26th, 1997, long after Bob Lazar said he worked at S4 Area 51. These are the words of Jerry Freeman. But wow, at 10:30 in the morning, I lay beneath downed cactus trees on a windswept ridge overlooking the most restricted place on Earth, Papoose Lake, the very soul of dreamland. The aliens appeared to be in short supply. So were the ex-Navy SEALs, who were supposed to be protecting this place. North of my position, I occasionally caught sight of the Black Hawk helicopter chasing the tourists away from the Air Force's front door near Groom Lake. That night, I lay awake in the darkness, high above that ancient playa. I half expected a close encounter of the third kind, but no such luck. Hale-Bopp gleamed in the northwest, the comet's remarkable brilliance strengthened by the clear desert air. Near the mountainous side of Papoose, I saw lights. Security vehicles? Hangar doors opening and closing? I don't profess to know. My purpose for intruding here was not to document UFO sightings, nor was I here to compromise national security. Jerry Freeman. So I found it very interesting. He did see lights near Papoose, but he said it could have been security vehicles just driving around. So it's not definitive enough for me. He, at this point, had already heard the Bob Lazar stories of the hangar doors and the flying saucers. He wasn't interested in that. He was interested in documenting for historical purposes where the 49ers traveled west. So I believe it is a stretch to say Jerry Freeman saw hangar doors, but he did indicate he did see lights. Rest in peace, Jerry Freeman died of cancer due to the radiation poisoning on March 20th, 2001.
Halt! Present your Identimat-compatible Majestic security clearance, please.
Concerning the hand scanner, it took me exactly 5 minutes to find the hand scanner. When I saw the hand scanner part on the documentary, I paused it, went straight to Google. It took me 5 minutes. Speaking of a hand, it took me exactly 5 minutes to find the hand scanner, the Identimat 2000. And I found it on years old, like a 10-year-old forum, talking about jets and stealth technology. They were talking about the hand scanner, the Identimat 2000. They posted pictures of it, said, yeah, they used it here and there. Why could Bob Lazar, in the past 15 years, not done a Google search and found the Identimat 2000 himself? I believe because he was waiting for someone else to find it, because it sounds better when someone else finds it and shows it and says, here's the proof. And Bob can say, yeah, that's it. Bob knew that was it because Bob likely saw the Identimat 2000 in the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, 1977 by Steven Spielberg. Kind of a huge mega blockbuster hit. There's a scene in this movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, 1977, in which a government agent puts his badge in, puts his hand on the biometrics hand geometry scanner, Identimat 2000 to be precise, takes his hand off and takes the badge out and walks through the door. And what happens to be on the other side of that door in this movie? Government officials at a secret base talking about extraterrestrials and flying saucers. Exactly the subject Bob Lazar claims to have been talking about after he popped his badge in, put his hand on the Identimat 2000, and walked through the doors at S4. The exact same subject. It's not a coincidence. It's too close to be a coincidence. So Bob Lazar is either using scenes from the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind and mixing them and confusing them with his past memories, or he used that scene as inspiration for the fabrication of his story. Big fans of Bob, and I'm a big fan of Bob, but more delirious fans of Bob. They're almost in a state where there's aliens everywhere. They're tinfoil hat UFO community members. Bob Lazar had access to seeing the Identimat 2000 in that 1977 movie. And those delirious UFO community members say It's impossible for him to have known about that. Impossible. Well, no, it wasn't impossible. We have concrete evidence right there to prove otherwise. I'm a fan of Bob Lazar's storytelling, but I'm also a huge fan of the truth. I want it to be true. I want to believe. I'm kind of like Mulder and Scully. I have a really wanting to believe side, and I have a skeptical side. I'm not a debunker. I don't go around debunking for the thrill of it. I'm just interested in paranormal subjects, and I'm interested in the truth. I'm interested in finding the truth. For this video, I've researched a great deal. A nerdy periodic table hoax for laughs as a joke that got out of hand. As off the wall as this sounds, there is some credibility to it being a periodic table fan joke that only periodic table geeks and nerds would understand and laugh at. There's a huge flaw in Bob Lazar's story involving the periodic table. Element 115, what would it prove? Scientifically, it would prove everything. My favorite quote from Bob Lazar is the following. If I pulled out a piece of 115 and said, here, what does that have to do with anything? It has everything to do with everything, and you know it. This is an actual quote from Bob Lazar from 1993.
But still, you need, some sort of evidence that this happened. If I pulled out a piece of 115 and said, here, well, what does that have to do with anything, and there's nothing that... But still, you need, some sort of evidence that this happened. If I pulled out a piece of 115 and said, here, well, what does that have to do with anything, and there's nothing that... But still, you need, some sort of evidence that this happened. If I pulled out a piece of 115 and said, here, well, what does that have to do with anything, and there's nothing that...
I have successfully stormed Area 51, and I grabbed me a triangle of the old Element 115. To give you some perspective on Bob Lazar's story, many probably don't know that this Element 115 flying saucer fuel looks similar to this. This is basically what the Element 115 alien fuel looked like. A triangle with a copper appearance, but it wasn't mere copper. According to Bob Lazar, it could fuel the flying saucers for 30 years on one single triangle of Element 115. So Bob Lazar said in 1989 he helped them at S4 figure out what the element they were dealing with was, and that he called it Element 115. I've always been curious why he called it Element 115, and I'm even more curious why he takes credit for Moscovium, the modern-day Element 115, which there's no evidence in any way, shape, or form. There is zero proof that the Element 115 Bob Lazar was talking about in 1989 in any way, shape, or form has anything to do with Moscovium, the modern-day actual Element 115 on the periodic table. The reason I say that it might be an inside joke among periodic table nerds is because, of course, Element 115 is going to be added to the periodic table. That's a fact. That's going to happen. In 1989, the periodic table went up to 103, I believe, but it wouldn't be called 104 because 104 is not a metal. But Element 110 is in the transitional metal category, and Element 113, which was not discovered yet in 1989, would have been in the other metal category, the post-transitional metals. Why did Bob Lazar not call it Element 113? It makes zero sense. But for Bob to claim today that fantasy Element 115 from 1989 at a top-secret facility is the same as Moscovium, the modern-day Element 115, the only way he can claim that is by also claiming they had a crystal ball over there at Area 51, which they gazed upon and they could see the future. And they could say, hey, you know that element in the future? It matches this one. It makes zero sense. Just because an element is tossed on the old periodic table, it doesn't mean someone that made up a story with the same number is confirmed. For example, I could say, I was on a UFO yesterday, and inside the UFO there was shag carpeting, and there was a beautiful alien woman, and she said, "Oh, I gotta go to the old Element 120 gas station," and she fills it up with the old Element 120. And I could say, you know what? If Element 120 is ever added to that old periodic table, my story of being in that UFO with that beautiful alien, going to that alien gas station where she filled it up with Element 120, it would be 100% confirmation and proof that it happened. It's proof I was in outer space at an alien gas station. It's not proof of anything. Element 120 will eventually be synthesized or discovered and added to the periodic table, period. That's how it works. It's a first-come, first-served basis, depending upon the category. Bob knew 115 is in the other metal category, and it was just a good way to claim when it's discovered that, yeah, that's the ticket, 115, it's the same stuff. People that don't know anything about the periodic table are like, yes, it's proof Bob was telling the truth. It's not proof of anything. It's proof that the periodic table has new elements constantly added to it on a regular basis, and nothing more. But I find it very interesting that Bob Lazar supposedly has a piece of the old Element 115. He's been reeling us in with this Element 115. Oh, I don't want to get myself in trouble, y'all. You don't want to get yourself in trouble. Where's the Element 115, Bob? Where is it? I don't want to incriminate myself. I don't want to get myself in any more trouble. Oh, I don't want to get myself in any more trouble. I don't want to incriminate myself. Element 115. Anyone who has seen the Freedom of Information Act request document at the Black Vault knows that the raid that did take place in conjunction with the police and the FBI on Bob Lazar's company, United Nuclear, during the documentary, we all know it had nothing to do with Element 115. Zero. The following is the official police report of the Bob Lazar raid, obtained via Freedom of Information Act, and is available on the Black Vault. This raid took place on July 19th, 2017, during the filming of the documentary. Despite what the documentary says, here are the facts, according to this police report. And I quote, "The reporting officer was also advised that this investigation started in Houghton, Michigan, in regards to a homicide investigation involving poison. The search warrant will be for records and poisons that Lazar does sell. They were searching for the records of a sale of a customer that purchased said poison from Bob Lazar. Someone associated with that sale ended up dead. It's a serious thing that the FBI doesn't take lightly. Reporting officer was advised that a hazmat team will also be involved in the execution of the search warrant. Because of the presence of the hazmat truck, they were clearly also searching for additional amounts of this poison." Page 2 of the report says the following, and I quote, "At about 0930, everyone went to the business for the search of the business. The hazmat team also conducted testing, and it was clear to begin the search. Everyone cleared at about 12 noon. When someone gets killed over a chemical that you sold someone, I think Bob was 100% innocent in the death, and he cooperated. He handed over the receipt, and he allowed them to search. And Bob keeps a really nice business. He sells legal nuclear elements with raw, legal, minuscule amounts of radioactive material that you can put a Geiger counter and see 0.1. For people interested in science, that's Bob's business. He sells that stuff. A tragic thing happened. For the director of the documentary to present that it had nothing to do with that and present that it had to do with a non-existent Element 115 that Bob Lazar has is very disrespectful, is very irresponsible. It almost tells me that the director of that documentary cares nothing of life or death of someone dying and wants to twist the facts in the direction of Element 115. The raid doesn't prove Element 115 exists. The raid proves that someone died in connection with something Bob sold, or in connection with a customer that purchased from Bob Lazar's business. So that's my number one gripe of the documentary, is that misleading information on the raid. We have the documents proving otherwise. There's a moment during the Joe Rogan podcast where Bob Lazar says, "Oh, I don't want to get myself in more trouble." We know you don't have the Element 115, Bob. And the acting is so bad that Beardman interjects and says, "He was raided." He was raided because someone died, having nothing to do with Element 115, a customer of Bob's. We know this to be a fact. Quit the misdirection. Quit the covering up. Quit the false information. As if that wasn't bad enough, I believe Bob Lazar slipped up to a great degree when talking about Element 115. Take a listen. Well, I don't want to talk about that, top secret weapons, stuff that you were working on. No, I'm talking about the 115, Well, I don't know. I have to think about how What's the problem? I don't want to get myself into more trouble by admitting something, so, I just have to dance around a couple. He was raided!
I understand you took some 115 home with you to do some testing on your own.
I obtained it, yeah.
Did you document any of your testing?
Yeah.
You did?
Yeah, the video, mostly videotape and things like that.
John said it was stolen from you later. Last night he said.
They stole it back.
Stole it back, he said?
Well, there's another level to that, but like I said, right now it's in private hands.
Okay.
Yeah, with such tight security around there, supposedly only 500 pounds of this material, how is it somebody can get some of it out of there?
Because the material is that they have there is essentially raw. The material is, it has to be machined into discs. These discs have to be stacked up and then cut into a cone shape and then sliced along the long axis of it. That work is done at Los Alamos. I'm not exactly sure Los Alamos knows what they're doing. Apparently they think that they're developing the little coins they're working on is some new type of armor. And having worked at Los Alamos and know people around that area, that's how I obtained some of it.
You don't have the Element 115, Bob. We know you don't. Now, I understand you had a prop that you convinced George Knapp that you had the 115, and you even conducted a cloud chamber experiment. I could tell you something about Moscovium. If you're going to make the claim, Bob, that Moscovium, the actual 115, is the same as your mythical 115, Moscovium is made from the bombardment of calcium element with americium element. And americium is highly radioactive. So radioactive that if you put something with americium in a cloud chamber, you would see the radioactive reactions in the cloud chamber. And the 1 minute of the cloud chamber footage that wasn't between some episodes of the Golden Girls, he actually filmed over the bending of the light, supposedly. I wouldn't be surprised if the bending of the light in the original cloud chamber footage that George Knapp personally saw wasn't some type of smoke and mirrors, light and shadow. But what we can see in the footage that wasn't taped over by Golden Girls episodes was the basic trails of nothing. We didn't really see any radioactivity in that cloud chamber footage. Upon looking at this cloud chamber footage, I have to make the assumption the 115 triangle was in this custom-made green pouch. And according to George Knapp, this 115 was buried, and he knows where it is. And he said after Bob dies, he's probably going to dig it up. Because element 115 is basically 50% americium, and americium is very radioactive, being created by bombarding plutonium with neutrons, I happened to find 2 examples of americium in a cloud chamber experiment. And here is one example. You can see the extreme radiation emitting and visible, reacting with the cloud in this cloud chamber experiment. Very obvious. Here's another cloud chamber experiment with americium, basically 50% element 115. And this experiment shows as well great radiation emitting and visible in the clouds. Compare that with Bob Lazar's element 115 supposedly in a cloud chamber experiment. We see no radiation reactions in the clouds. Nothing. Whatever is in this chamber, I seriously doubt is radioactive. I seriously doubt it is element 115, either the mythical spaceship fuel for flying saucers, which would probably be very radioactive, or the actual moscovium element 115, which is actually radioactive. And we would see radiation reactions in the cloud chamber experiment if that were the case. But that is not what we see in this video.
Bob said that the key to it was this element 115. He had a piece of it. I saw it. In fact, he had a little experiment they did with what's called a cloud chamber, where they had, it looked to me like light. They had a piece of this 115 in this chamber. They put some smoke in it, and it seemed, and then had a beam of light through it, and the light bent. He had that piece. I saw the experiment. What happened to it, that's a story for another time. It's in a spot now where nobody could get to it, but it's still there. One of these days, maybe after Bob's gone, I'll go dig it up. As at the time that he told us the story about element 115 did not exist. It does exist now. It's been synthesized. They've made it in a lab. It only lasts for microseconds, but it is real. They've confirmed that it's now on the element chart.
I'd be digging it up right now, George Knapp. If you want to prove your friend's story is true, you cut off a tiny piece of it and you send it to a lab. They do a spectrum analysis on it, and they can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that it's a stable moscovium. Oh my gosh, stable moscovium, stable 115. It would be the rarest element on planet Earth, even having one tiny little triangle of it. It'd be worth $1 trillion. And Bob Lazar, it's too bad he didn't send it to a lab back in the 80s or 90s, because he could have named it Lazarium. He could have named it Bob Lazarisium. He could have named it after himself, vindicated himself, and proven to the world, and had his name permanently on the periodic table to prove that he not only is sharing the truth about Area 51 and 15 miles south S4 and the flying saucers and ET anti-gravity drive technology, but he would be in the history books of the guy who brought stable element 115 to the world, brought technology to the world. Bob always says, it's a shame that they're not bringing this technology to the world. Well, you, Bob Lazar, are not bringing 115 to the world, a stable version of it, because after a spectrum analysis is done on whatever piece of copper you have in some custom-made pouch buried in the earth, you're going to know that after a spectrum analysis is done, people will see that your story is full of holes and it's just a piece of copper and not a piece of element 115. Bob Lazar actually had the gall. He actually had the audacity to say, what would it prove if I had some 115? What would it prove? It would prove everything. Every single thing you've ever said. It would prove everything, definitively. A to Z, I would believe you if you brought that 115 to the table. I don't think the government would even do much. So you snagged some. Big whoop. Your story's true. You're a hero. I think you'd be exonerated. You'd be pardoned and given the Medal of Honor, Nobel Peace Prize. You would literally be recognized as someone who is the whistleblower of whistleblowers. But currently the world sees you as a conspiracy theorist. That's just what they see you as. It's too bad that you can't bring that 115 to the table. but I personally believe no 115, no dice. Part 2 of this Bob Lazar special will continue. We don't have the time to cover everything in this video, but stay tuned. Part 2 coming soon. There's a live stream, a Bob Lazar live stream coming soon. A Part 3 coming soon as well. I thank you for watching. This has been John Razimus with Hoax Hunter. Be seeing you.